Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Hobby Hour. My name is Kirk Watson. I'm the founding dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs, and we host this webinar, the Hobby Hour, every third Wednesday of the month at noon. So go ahead and start marking your calendars. Next month, we will have with us at the chairs of the two partisan caucuses in the Texas Senate, Chairman Paul Betancourt, who chairs the Republican caucus, and Chairwoman Carol Alvarado, who chairs the Democratic caucus. And of course, we're going to be talking about the upcoming legislative session that will start the next month in January. Today, we're going to talk about the elections that we just came out of, all the time and all of it. We got a panel of 4 people who are expert in that, and we're going to try to dig down into some of that. If you have questions, feel free to start posting your questions, and I'll do my best to work those questions in as we go along. But feel free to post those. Let me introduce our panel because I'm very excited about it. First, I want to introduce Renée Cross. Renée is the senior director at the Hobby School of Public Affairs. She is a lecturer in political science. She is one of the people that is a go-to person for her involvement in various research and surveys and polling, and is a frequent commentator on what's going on in all things politics. So we're happy to have Renée. She's joined by Gromer Jeffers. Gromer is a political writer for the Dallas Morning News. He has covered numerous elections and campaigns for many years now. He is also someone that people rely on and bring in to not only comment on things, but to also moderate things like he was one of the people chosen to be a moderator of the debate in the U.S. Senate race this year, the one debate that I think that they had between Senator Cornyn and the Democratic opponent, M.J. Hagar. We're also joined by Dr. Richard Murray. I'll come up with a lot of words when I try to describe Dr. Murray. He's an iconic political scientist in our state. I've also referred to him as the godfather of political science in the state of Texas. And that is said with the greatest respect that I can provide him. He is a pollster, a pontificator, and a great teacher. He is someone that students that get a chance to learn from Dr. Murray, they really get something. And so we're excited to have him here. And last but not least is Alexa Ura, who is an associate editor and reporter at the Texas Tribune. She is the Tribune's demographics reporter, and I have found her to be someone that follows the details of what's going on with the electorate in a really remarkable way. So we're pleased to have her with us. So with that set of introductions, I'm going to just jump in. And the first question I want to ask the panel, and I'm going to start with Renée. I'm going to start with the way I introduced y'all, if you don't mind, is you don't have to focus on Texas, but I'd kind of like to get a little feel for Texas and what you think. But what do you think was the most significant outcome or most noteworthy outcome of the election cycle we just lived through?
Well, of course, I'm going to focus on Texas, but I think the most significant thing is that we proved that we're no longer a non-voting state. We increased our voter turnout tremendously and among all groups. The results overall, I wouldn't say there was a lot of surprises, but I think the big thing that everyone can be proud of is just the massive increase in participation.
Gromer, what do you think?
I agree with Renée. That was so refreshing to see voter turnout. As you know, Texas has been dubbed a non-voting state for so long. But to me, the most significant outcome was the result in a battle for the Texas House. Republicans maintaining control of the House. Democrats had to win 9 seats to take control. They didn't get there, didn't come close to getting there. And that will have repercussions from here on out because of redistricting and other issues. And it was just a mental really a blow mentally to Democrats who really thought they had a chance to take the House. And because they didn't and the way they lost, in particular in some areas like Tarrant County, and even those 2 seats in Dallas County that they were hoping to get. I think that was a big blow to them. So that was the most significant outcome to me.
Dr. Murray, what do you think? What was most significant to you?
Seems to me that this election confirms how profoundly the national party system has been transformed. This didn't start with Donald Trump. It was underway to some degree, but we just have a very different political coalition emerging across the country on both the Republican and the Democratic side. You know, in 2016, that new Republican coalition worked just barely to elect Trump despite a deficit in the popular vote. But it didn't work in the battleground states, just barely going the other way this time around. But the pattern's almost exactly the same. There are almost no counties that moved much. Trump lost a few counties that he won before, but not many. Voting turnout increased tremendously, but it increased uniformly. So that didn't make a hell of a lot of difference. And it's just changing our whole politics. And on the redistricting, it'll filter down into Texas. I've been working on these maps for 50 years. This is going to be one hell of a challenge, particularly to the map drawers. That's the Republicans, because they're dealing with a very dynamic state in which, for 2011, for example, the map drawers could easily assume River Oaks and the affluent areas in Dallas, they're safe, no worry. Trump dramatically reduces the Republican vote in those precincts. And now he's increased the vote in some areas, but he's put in play a lot of voters that don't like the new direction of the Republican Party. And that's why they lost the 2 congressional seats in 2018. Those were the most Republican districts in the state 30 years ago. And they're the first 2 to lose when you start seeing the state change.
Yeah. Okay. I want to come back to a couple of things. I made notes because I want to come back to a couple of questions I have about part of what you said. Alexa, tell me what you thought was the most noteworthy.
Yeah, I think the most significant, if I'm a voter, particularly a voter of color, is obviously what happened with the battle for the Texas House and it remaining completely in Republican control going into the 2021 legislative session and the redistricting that should happen or may happen depending on when we get the census data to do that map drawing. You know, this is the first year in many decades that lawmakers will be able to draw up their maps without having to prove first that they don't harm voters of color. And we know Texas lawmakers have a pretty bad history when it comes to this, whether it was Democrats or Republicans. Most recently, it's been Republicans drawing these maps, where the maps are drawn to dilute the power of voters of color. And so I think from a voter standpoint, that's the most significant. From a more political standpoint, I think what was notable about this election is how unsettled politics in Texas remain, despite the fact that there were hardly any surprises. If you were kind of thinking about the status quo in Texas, the status quo is in this election different than it was in 2016, right? Largely because of the gains of 2018. And I think we are still wondering whether 2018 was a blip and there was some, looking to 2020 to decide that. And I'm not sure that any of that has been decided yet. And I think a lot of Texas politics actually remains pretty unsettled in that way.
So I want to quickly follow up on part of what you said, because you made a comment about redistricting that you said that this will be the first time we have redistricting where it doesn't, in essence, it doesn't have to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department. Why don't you explain to our listeners and others that might not know the details of why that's the case, why that is the case?
Sure. For many decades, Texas was on the list of either states or jurisdictions, municipalities that basically had to get federal approval of any changes to its election laws, including its maps, because it had a history of discriminating against voters of color. It was one of these federal safeguards that had been in place for many decades. In 2013, the Supreme Court, in a case not from Texas, but that obviously affected Texas, essentially guts the Voting Rights Act and takes away this protection that had existed for voters of color for many years that had effectively protected voters of color for many years, largely finding that the discrimination it was meant to protect from was a thing of the past. Of course, we have seen rulings from federal courts after this ruling finding intentional discrimination at the hands of lawmakers when it comes to voters of color that they are elected to represent. And so, this will be a big test. I think we can all sort of agree that this is going to end up in litigation no matter when these maps are drawn and how they are drawn. But there's no longer anything that protects voters from possible discrimination in maps. You have to challenge it after the fact. And of course, the challenge there is that elections happen every 2 years, and there could be elections that happen under maps that could be legally dubious, at least as it concerns voters of color and whether they're fairly represented.
Go ahead, Gromer.
Yeah, if I can jump in, there were lawsuits on the 2011 maps, I believe, that were still active,
Right.
Several election cycles, after the fact. And it just showed you the absurdity of the process. But also to Alexa's point, in the history of Texas redistricting since the Voting Rights Act, there's never been a redistricting plan that has sailed through and been accepted by the feds. That's how important that Section 5 clearance rule was. And now that it's gone, she's right, you have to sue after the fact, which is a big hassle, a big pain, and takes away that layer of protection. That's why this election was so important.
It'll also be interesting to see, depending upon what happens in the Georgia U.S. Senate races, what would happen with the Voting Rights Act if the Democrats or the Republicans end up in control of the Senate.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that a lot of people, it's not being talked about as much as I would have expected with regard to that Georgia Senate race. Renee, let me come back to you and ask several of you mentioned the voter turnout being a big deal. I mean, you started with that. And also talked about the fact that the Republicans maintained control of the House, that in fact it was a net in the way things played out. Talk a little bit about that. Texas was called a battleground. I mean, everybody was talking about it being a battleground. There was talk of taking the House back, 9 seats, that kind of thing. There was talk of the presidential election, maybe Biden winning in Texas, which would have been something very unique for decades. It just didn't turn out that way. What happened?
Well, a lot of it was talk, just talk. We did have some polls done outside of Texas that had Biden leading. Those within Texas, I think, were much closer. But frankly, I think there was a lot of hype, and the thought that we could go from 2018 to 2020 and pick up another 9 state House seats, I think was really unrealistic. And while I know a lot of folks, particularly those of the Democratic persuasion, are all gloom and doom about the results, but they held all of those seats, save one, out in Katy, that I think is quite an achievement, because in 2018, everybody was saying, well, the Democrats got those suburban districts because of the excitement of Beto. Well, 2 years later, we didn't have a real exciting Democratic candidate at the top of the ticket. So I think the Democrats should feel good about holding on to those 12 or 11 seats. And then when you go down lower level races, particularly among counties and those large metro counties, Democrats are sweeping those positions, even in, formerly Republican strongholds. So I think, all the hype about Texas being a true battleground state was just that. It was a lot of hype. Are we starting to lean a little less Republican? Absolutely. But you just don't have these major changes from one party to another overnight.
Dr. Murray, what's your read on what happened why it didn't appear to be quite the battleground everybody thought it was. You agree with what Renee's saying?
Pretty much. I think we should keep in mind that while Biden-Harris was probably the best ticket the Democrats could end up having to win the Electoral College and the popular vote, it was not a strong ticket in Texas. Compared, we were looking at Clinton's performance along the border 4 years ago compared to Biden's. Remember, Hillary Clinton knew a hell of a lot more about Texas, and in 2008 had poured, with her husband's guidance, tons of money into the state, largely into Hispanic areas. They had a history here. Texas was vital to her nomination campaign a dozen years ago. Biden's from a different part of the country. Bill Clinton obviously grew up next door to Texas, knew a lot about it. Texas was never in their plan to win the presidency. Biden's campaign was remarkably focused on restoring the blue wall. Of course, you compete as always in Florida, but the fishing looked a lot better in Arizona from day one. And then late, it became clear Georgia's a lot more in play. And Texas never figured in. And, Biden never came here, had no campaign organization or structure. And that showed. And, his whole national strategy was much more to go after remobilizing the black vote than bringing in a lot of that. In Arizona, you had special factors. I mean, the Democrats should have hired the sheriff of Maricopa County to be their number one advocate, because he activated a whole bunch of folks. But hey, Joe Arpaio didn't travel much outside of Arizona. And, that 300 miles east in El Paso, the Democratic vote went down by 10 points.
Yeah. Gromer, let me kind of tie into what they've said. We started by talking about the big voter turnout, and we then started talking about the battleground and why it didn't turn out to be quite the battleground. Was the hype of if I can use that word, of what could happen, or the fact that it was a battleground and did that, in your view, drive some of this voter turnout? Was that something that we ought to worry about, not having as much voter turnout in the future if we don't think it's a battleground?
Yeah, well, let's not underestimate the fact that Republicans were ready this time.
Yeah.
They learned the lessons from 2018. John Cornyn, for instance, watched Beto O'Rourke take Ted Cruz to the brink. And immediately he put together, kind of an all-star team of consultants and people running his campaign, raised money early, and got ready. And you saw he really, really outperformed MJ Hagar. So they were ready. And also the messaging was a little off for Democrats in Texas, and they got caught up in the defund the police stuff and Green New Deal. And I think the professor is right about the candidates and whether they were right for Texas. So yeah, they should be proud of sort of, Biden got over 5 million votes. Hagar got, last time I checked, 4.8 million votes. Those are building blocks. But you're right, Kurt. I mean, you got to worry about turnout dropping in the next election. It's a midterm election. And here's the thing about the hype. If you're a Democrat, will you be able to go to Democratic Party donors again and convince them that you have a shot at winning a statewide race and getting them to pony up that money again? Will you get them to give in the way that they gave to House candidates again? That's the big problem. Will the money be there for them next time?
Yes, that's going to be a big issue. Alexa, I want to kind of slightly shift and ask you a question, particularly as you study demographics the way you do. But and we've also had a question that's similar to this pop up in our chat room or in the Q&A. The professor just talked about, Dr. Murray just talked about the Valley and campaigning in the Valley. And of course, some of the results in the Valley, some people act like they're surprised by, because the president did better in the Valley than people would have expected. There tends to be this sort of, and I don't want to overstate it, but somewhat of a monolithic thought about how Latinos are going to vote. Why don't you comment on what happened during this cycle and whether people are drawing these lines too neatly, if you will, about how they think people of color and Latinos will vote.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few things. I think generally speaking, we have heard that refrain for a long time. Texas isn't a red state, it's a non-voting state. Well, this year it voted a lot more than it normally does, and it remained a red state, right? There are still enough Republican voters in the state to keep it red, even when turnout is higher. But I think when you look at things like what happened in the Valley and in other counties along the border, there is, I think, an oversimplification that often happens when you talk about voters in these communities, because a majority of them, a vast majority of them, are Hispanic. And it's an oversimplification you don't necessarily see in other places. If you spent any time in the Valley or in other border communities like Laredo, where I'm from, you know that, yes, there are a lot of immigrants and children of immigrants. And then you also have children of immigrants who work for Customs and Border Patrol. You know that law enforcement is a massive employer in many of these communities. You also know that there are vast swaths of the border that are rural. We've been hearing so much about rural and urban divides since 2016 and what that means politically. And there, for some reason, it's so much easier to kind of parse the nuance of that out in states like Pennsylvania than it is when you're talking about the border. I think it's an oversimplification of communities, because there is sort of a shared ethnic identity, and it's a nuance that's often missed when you look at places like the Valley and what happened there. When you look at some of these other small communities where Trump did better, I don't think you can separate the appeal that the president had to voters in other rural communities, more socially conservative communities, from what you saw happen there. Just because it is mostly Hispanic people should not have been an indicator that that appeal would have been different.
So Dr. Murray, riff on that a minute. What should the parties be doing? Both parties, but certainly the Democratic Party has, for many years, touted the idea that the growing Hispanic population, and if it would vote in the numbers that is represented by the population, Democrats are going to get elected. What should the two parties be doing with regard to that voting bloc? And I guess the first part of that question is, should they be treating it as a voting bloc?
Well, I don't want to denigrate the importance of the border. It's a part of the country where many people have real huge needs that have to be addressed politically that aren't. But one thing to keep in mind, if you take everybody from El Paso all along the border and then cut up to Nueces, which I do in an analysis, that's 8% of the Texas electorate and declining. All those counties are growing way below the state average. They're going to lose legislative seats. Every election going forward, they'll probably stay somewhat Democratic or very Democratic, depending upon the especially. But the battle for Texas is the battle in the metropolitan areas, because that's where the population's growing. We have enormous increases in voting in the metropolitan areas compared to the rest of the state. Like the Panhandle, I predicted the vote in every county, and the Panhandle was easy. You get within 2 or 3 votes. They're 82% Republican. They ain't growing. And that's going to be an enormous problem for all these regions on the edge of Texas, including the Hispanic areas. Not enough people to warrant their current legislative delegations. All those seats are got to be pushed into the center of the state where the population is. That's going to be a huge problem for everybody. Republicans are going to have a tremendous problem. They've got to defend 23 congressional seats, 18 Senate seats, 83 state house seats. And they have to move their rural seats. They have to do away with 3 or 4 of them, and 1 Hispanic probably, and move 5, 6 seats into the metro areas. And I think the suburbs, like Bob Bullock said, I think 25 years ago, as Texas was turning red, it's the suburbs. And I think the dynamics of the state are in these incredibly diverse suburban areas that we have across Texas that make redistricting a nightmare, because you have so much instability as these new neighborhoods emerge. And from day one, they're the United Nations. We have had no net Anglo growth in Texas since 2000. We've added 8 million people. Do the math.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean these 8 million people are Democrats. It just means you got to compete for them. And, you know, the Hispanic vote is increasingly the vote not in the old barrios of Dallas or Harris County. It's in the suburbs.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to just add one point, and that's that there's been so much attention on these border communities, and I think notable to the extent that obviously that there's some retrospection that has to happen among Democrats about the margin loss there. But there are more Hispanic or Latino people living in Hays and Fort Bend counties than in so many of these border communities, right? And to the professor's point, when you see the growth of the state, when you see the diversity in that growth, right? Because almost half of our growth is natural increase since 2010, right? A lot of people like to think about international immigration or people moving here from other states, but half of our growth is actually people having babies, and those babies eventually becoming 18-year-olds who can vote. And those babies are more likely to be Hispanic than they are to be white. And so I think when we think about Hispanic voters and the room to build support among them for both parties, we're not just talking about Hispanic people in the border, right? We are talking about people who are living very different lives in very different communities, and the experience of a 59-year-old Hispanic rancher in Starr County is going to be very different to a 20-year-old who grew up in Fort Bend County. And that's the nuance that's often lost, but that has to be a part of any sort of a commitment to growing the margins with these voters moving forward.
And Kurt,
Yeah.
Richard said something that's really on point as well. You got to compete for
Yes.
those votes. And when you look at the top of the ticket, and look, Rebecca Acuna and her team did a great job with what they had. But you know, if Biden doesn't come here once and do his thing, that tells you something. And if you look at the other rates, the Senate rates, I mean, MJ Hagar, in my view, didn't do a good job of outreach to communities of color. It was a lot of suburban focus, and it should have been that. But I think that she was lacking when it came to, you know, Black voters and Hispanic voters, and the numbers show it. And so you're gonna have to get serious about outreach, not just at election time, but sort of build messages and build coalitions starting now if you really, really want to go after those voters. And that goes for Republicans as well.
Yeah.
Let me add to that. I think we've seen that targeted outreach works for either party. And particularly if you look back in Texas, George W. Bush, Rick Perry did an excellent job in reaching out to Latino voters, and subsequently got quite a bit more support. Things tapered down. Now it ticked back up just a little bit. And I think bottom line is the parties can't take anybody for granted. And both Republicans and Democrats are going to have to work hard to keep Latino vote in their majority, as well as the suburban vote that right now may be trending a little bit more Democratic, but I think we're still on that edge where nothing's a done deal. Yeah,
I want to ask all of y'all about something that is a thread through this discussion, and particularly with the way Alexa addressed it when she talked about people being born and turning 18 at 18 years later. The youth vote was a big deal in this election, and you know, that younger generation, as Alexa suggests, is in many ways voting based upon their alignment with their youth, as opposed to necessarily the way some people have tried to align them based upon race or ethnicity. Renee, talk a little bit about the youth vote in this cycle.
Well, from the numbers that I've seen so far, youth vote was definitely up by some measures between 8 to 10%. And, you know, maybe that doesn't sound like that much, but in certain states, it's a lot. We saw that Latino voters, and particularly young Latino voters, came out in Arizona, more than likely helping to tip that state. In Georgia, we saw the same thing, but with African Americans, with young voters coming out to vote for the first time. We had good voter turnout here in Texas. Obviously, it wasn't enough to tip the state to Biden, because we've seen that young people overwhelmingly supported Biden, even in Texas. I believe it's 62% Biden, 36% Trump. So, you know, again, while 2020 can be celebrated by the Republicans for keeping their seats and John Cornyn's win and so forth, if we start digging down into who voted for who, you know, Republicans are going to have to organize an outreach program to young people, regardless of race and ethnicity, because it's not going their way at this point.
Well, I would like to jump in.
Please.
On the Republican side, what in the hell is Trump going to do? He ain't going to go quietly unless it's due to disease or something else. But, you know, coming out of this, he has one enormous asset. 73 million people just voted for him, and he is totally in control of the Republican electorate. I can't see him giving that up. I don't know if he's going to announce for re-election or election in 2024, but given his financial and legal problems, he's going to, it seems to me, work very hard and diligently to keep his base. And that's going to create an enormous fight within the Republican Party, top to bottom. And Trump is such a dominating figure that even out of office, he's going to profoundly affect politics in our state. You know, like it puts a real problem in place for our junior senator, who learned very quickly at the Cleveland convention, thou not dare say a bad word about Donald Trump, whatever you might think of him. So it kind of freezes the Republican presidential field in an extraordinary way. And it seems to me the lines of division that Trump has so changed in Texas, which has pushed the suburban vote to being very competitive. That's probably going to continue for the next 4 years if Trump remains the dominant figure within the Republican Party, which I fully expect.
Gromer, you and Alexa, comment either on the youth vote or on what we think the next 4 years end up looking like if Trump is running for president.
Yeah, for the youth vote, I think the key there for Democrats or anyone that wants to benefit from it is to make it more consistent. You know, you saw.
What do you mean by that? Make it more consistent.
In 2008 with Barack Obama, right? You saw an overwhelming a jump in the youth vote, right? A lot of young people, but in subsequent years, it was kind of flat or decreased. You saw the youth vote across the country increase this time, but what will it do in future elections? So you have to get it more, in my view, consistent, and that takes outreach from both parties, right? In terms of the next 4 years, yeah, I mean, what will Trump do? And also, this, just to bring it home to Texas, is someone like Texas Governor Greg Abbott in a better position now that Trump has lost and Biden is president than he would have been if Trump had won and remained president and still been that target for Democrats and that possible albatross for Republican candidates. Now, we didn't see Trump be all that much of an albatross this time, but you know what I mean. Democrats were able to raise money off of them, and it was thought that the races would be closer because of Trump. Now that Trump is, at least as an elected official, gone, we think, is Abbott, with a midterm approaching, in a better position now than he would have been with Trump as a sitting president. I think he'll use him as a foil, much like he used Barack Obama as a foil.
Yeah. Alexa, what are your thoughts on that?
You know, I wanted to comment on the youth vote or younger voters in general, because I think there was a lot of progress that was made. I think there are a lot of people who have been working specifically to engage with younger voters who are probably looking at this election and see signs they're encouraged by what happened. They probably feel like that investment was maybe worth their time in some ways, despite the complications of trying to do that engagement during a pandemic. But I think one thing that would be interesting to look at, we did this analysis ahead of the 2018 election, sort of preparing for what we knew were going to be a lot of questions about turnout in Texas. And the numbers showed that the voters who are between 45 and 65 or older are so much more likely to vote than voters who are between 18 and 34, right? I don't know how much that has changed since then. I haven't done an analysis to look at a post 2020 version of that, but there is still room to grow for young voters. And if I'm someone who's focused on that sort of cohort of voters, you're probably feeling optimistic if you're able to do the work, right? If you are able to upkeep that engagement. And I think looking forward to the next 4 years and, a second Trump run for presidency, I think that going back to sort of what I said at the top of this, there are things that remain so unsettled about the Texas political landscape, about our electorate. We've had conversations about what does this look like in 2022, and is the result of that different if you maintain the electorate that you've had up to now, or if it goes back to what midterm election electorates are more like, which obviously favor Republicans. We have a different electorate. And I think the question is, does that electorate sustain itself going into these future elections, or do we see sort of a retreat to what have been more typical electorates in the state, particularly when it comes to midterm elections, and obviously in a presidential with a Trump back on the ballot, that is sort of even more uncertainty to the equation, I think.
So are you saying that because we had such a large turnout, 2 million more voters in Texas, that the old standard line that midterms, when you've got a president out of the party, for a Democrat in the White House, that we ought to expect the midterm to be ugly for Democrats in Texas? Are you suggesting that the difference in our voter turnout pattern this last time may signal a real change in that?
I think the conventional wisdom is that a midterm electorate is not favorable to the party of the person who's in the presidency. And
Right.
if you're talking about Texas, obviously that's probably more pronounced toward Republicans. I
Right.
think the question for the upcoming midterm is, does that electorate look closer to 2018 than it does to 2014? And that will be a big determining factor. Obviously, there's been population growth since then, and a large increase in the amount of registered voters. But I think that's the question. Does the electorate look closer to the one we've seen over the last two elections, or does it revert back to what we're used to seeing in midterm elections?
And Kurt, let me just add something also. The positive for Democrats going into a midterm where they're expected to do, I wouldn't say poorly, but it have challenges. Let me just put it that way, is they now know, speaking of the electorate changing, they now know that they can get 5 million votes. There's a candidate out there who's done it, Biden, and Hagar had close to 5 million votes. So they know that the possibility is there. The key now is to work hard and go get it. And if you put that number up there, it will be difficult for Republicans to match. Now, Republicans have shown that they can do better than that. But you see what I'm saying? There's an avenue for Democrats to grow. They've seen that they've increased their numbers through the years. And if they can just keep consistently putting pressure on Republicans cycle after cycle by improving on their performances, that's a good thing for them. So it doesn't have to be doom and gloom. And that means that Republicans will have to be diligent and can't get caught napping. And you can argue that that's what happened in 2018.
Yeah, the numbers in Texas were that even though Trump won, 52-46, or in that range, there was an improvement by the Democrats over Clinton by 3% or a million more voters, and there was an improvement in House races and in congressional races by 6 or 7 points better on average than you'd had before. Renee, let me ask you a question about the voting experience and what happened in Texas. You know, we started with the thing that was the biggest lesson from this was people turning out to vote, but we had some differences this time. For example, this was our first time to go into a booth or so to speak, a booth and vote without straight ticket. Give us your read on what that really meant. Did it make that big a difference overall? Did it hurt one party or the other? Give us your thoughts.
Well, it looks like overall, it really didn't make that big a difference. I think part of that is just because of all the attention on the election this year, that people were more engaged. If this would have happened 6 years ago, say in 2014, I think it probably would have had a much bigger effect. Going forward, you know, we'll see. I think if people aren't as engaged and in tune to the candidates, it could show much bigger difference than what we saw this year.
Dr. Murray, you study this stuff pretty closely. Well, you know, in Harris County, I think there was a small drop off, but it wasn't that much different than what you saw in 12 and 16 even.
Yeah.
What's your feel about the straight ticket? Because a lot of people were very worried about this.
Very little effect, hardly any difference in the roll off compared to 2018 when we still had the straight ticket option. Very often structural changes are hard to predict how they work out. The only law in that regard is the law of unintended consequences. Something happens, but it's not necessarily what you thought would occur. The Republicans could see they were losing these big urban counties with people not knowing anything about the candidates. They were just voting for all the D's or R's, and they still lost them all. Didn't make any difference in Dallas County or Harris County or Travis, and won't. People's partisan identities, maybe not in rural and small towns, but in big urban counties where you don't know anything about most of these people down ballot. You've taken the trouble to get to the polls, you'll usually go down and vote, and it's, you know, your party identity overwhelmingly predicts your vote, and that's not going to change.
Gromer, let me ask you a question along those lines. As you were looking and studying how people were lining up in the different races, and particularly as you were talking about Dallas County, and whether or not those seats that the Democrats had picked up, you know, the Turner seat and other seats like that the Democrats had picked up before and holding on to them. Did you see how were the campaigns done so that they made sure they weren't having a drop off when it came to voting at the top of the ticket?
Well, the down ballot candidates, unlike in previous elections, had a lot more money really than I can imagine, than I've seen ever before. You know, the question was always, will House candidates on both sides run out of money, right, Kirk? I mean, you know, so that's what you worry about in these House races and these down ballot races. But when you turn on your television set and you're watching a sporting event and there's a state house candidate commercial, you're like, wow, you know, what's going on here? So in many ways, the down ballot candidates were driving the action in some of these counties. Tarrant County, Biden apparently won Tarrant County, right? Yeah. But if that is the case, then how did all 5 Republican targeted House members win and win easily? So that shows you that there's something was going on down ballot that was maybe it had something to do with straight ticket voting. Those Democratic candidates didn't get an automatic vote from Biden voters or younger voters who maybe didn't want to go down the ballot in previous elections and voted for president, wanted to get Trump out, voted for Biden. Well, they would have to go down the ballot if you were a House candidate to get that vote this time around. So maybe it had an effect, but I think what you saw was down ballot incumbents were able to make their case on both sides much better than in previous elections. In Dallas County, in Colin Allred's Congressional District 32, there was such a thing as a Biden voter, an Allred voter, Cornyn voter, and Morgan Meyer. Somebody who voted for Biden, Allred, Cornyn, and Morgan Meyer, the state rep. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, and you didn't just see that just in Dallas.
Exactly, all over.
All over, and you saw some narrow. In fact, one of the people with the Q&A pointed out how some of these races were closer and the spread was not as much. Alexa, let me ask you about that. Is that a sign that voter opinion is more similar than we sometimes give it credit for, or is it that there's just real extreme polarization, or is it? How would you react to that?
I mean, I think the hard thing to measure here is that the preferences of the state across the board cumulatively can be very different to the way these districts are drawn, right? Especially when you're talking about some of these urban districts and some of these bigger counties. The districts are drawn to be partisan. They're gerrymandered in a way to benefit the incumbent that has been sitting there. And I apologize, that's my dog barking in the background.
Everybody's dogs.
The dog wants to be heard.
He's very emotional about partisan politics. But I think there, to me, when I look at these spreads, what's interesting to me is that if you look at a statewide race and use that as any sort of indicator of what a geographic community thinks and feels and who they support, you're probably wrong, right? There's such a divide in what you're seeing in these statewide races compared to what you're seeing in some of these House races. You just can't overgeneralize from top to bottom, I think.
Yeah. So Renee, let me ask you a question about the campaigning. We've kind of got off on how the campaigns were actually run. You know, the pandemic changed the way down ballot campaigns were run. You know, there weren't as many events. This is easy and simplistic to say it this way, and I know it when I say it, but the Democrats tended to not want to go out and knock on doors. They wanted to do things online and virtually and that sort of thing. The Republicans, on the other hand, were doing more door knocking. From your analysis, how did that change things? How did that change the perspective?
You know, during this whole discussion, I've been wondering, why are we focusing so much on this year as far as a prediction of the future? Because this year is so dissimilar to any year we've ever had for, you know, a number of reasons. But, you know, initially, the Republicans and certainly President Trump's campaign in 2016 had a far superior digital outreach campaign. The Democrats took note and they stepped up their digital outreach. So really the difference in some cases, and likely affecting quite a few of those suburban districts where the margins were so tight, I think the Republicans did benefit from having a much more on the ground field operation than what the Democrats went with this particular year. But again, I certainly hope we're not in the same situation in terms of a pandemic, say in 2022. So we'll see how that works.
Well, it's interesting to me. One of the things, and I want to hear the other three comment on this, but from my perspective, the concept of in your face, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I mean that in a positive way. You know, the old-fashioned shoe leather thing may have made a big difference. Dr. Murray, what do you think about that?
No, I think that the fact that the Trump campaign had a lot of money at the beginning and they invested it in a much more sort of scientific way. They had time and money. They didn't have an opponent in the primary. They spent a little too much money and ran out. And the Democrats had a shower of dollars, but late, which doesn't help you nearly as much in terms of putting a ground game together. And maybe they overspent in some places like Maine. But a couple of things, if we look at, we talked a little bit about the movement of the Hispanic vote nationally and in Texas. Two other things I'd like to emphasize. Trump is an absolute turnout machine of incredible power. And it turned out plenty of people to vote against him. They were not really motivated to vote so much for Joe Biden, but to get rid of Trump. But he turned out 10 million more votes for himself. And these low propensity voters down ballot saved Republicans in state after state because while they were there voting for Trump, they're not very partisan in past elections, no vote history, but they mostly voted Republican. Now, that didn't save him presidentially because we had an unusually large number of longtime Republican identifying voters, not just women, but educated, that were not voting for Trump. But they didn't vote for very many other Democrats. So that helped Biden, of course, and that, Biden didn't win Pennsylvania by turning out a lot more minority voters. He won Pennsylvania by just stomping Trump in the suburbs. But look at what happened in that congressional district outside of Philadelphia, the area my wife's from, Montgomery County. Trump gets clobbered, and that sinks him statewide. But their Republican moderate congressman wins by 12 points. Well, Those races are right together. So pretty clearly, we had this upscale Republican revolt. They don't want Trump. And, the Lincoln Project spoke to them, and it worked. Biden picked up 3, 4, 5 million votes, but Trump's over on the other side, turning out these low propensity voters that save a lot of Republicans around Texas because they needed them. No Republican had ever gotten 5 million votes before. Trump got close to 6 million. An extraordinary improvement. I mean, I think the record previously was 4.7 million. So Trump, my goodness, he's great for journalism, people who want to write memoirs, lawyers, and political scientists in no particular order.
Gromer, you're the one that brought it up that caused me to go off on how the campaigns got run, and Dr. Murray's right about what also motivates. But from your perspective, what were the key motivators other to turn out that vote? And did it include things like door to door versus just getting things digitally?
Yeah, Trump was the top motivator on both sides, and for Republicans, they really never went inside. They started their ground game early. They were registering voters early as well. I mean, Democrats got a lot of publicity about their voter registration programs, but quietly Republicans were registering voters as well. And you had a candidate like Beth Van Dyne, a former Irving mayor who ran for Congress in Kenny Marchant's the seat that he's given up in District 24. She was out there aggressively from the start. Her opponent, Candace Valenzuela, really didn't campaign, and her folks didn't knock door to door. Maybe in the last final weeks they did, but for the bulk of the campaign, they followed the COVID protocols and didn't engage. I think that kind of hurt. And in one of the state house races, I talked to Retta Bowers, the incumbent. She's from Rowlett, ran against Will Douglas. Will Douglas was out there campaigning, and she told me, she said, Gromer, look, I got to get out there. I got to get out there and meet the people. And she started safely, right? But started her ground game, and it paid off for her. And so that was a motive that helped Republican candidates and other candidates who engage. The other motivator, though, I find in Texas, the notion that Texas would flip on either side. If you're a Democrat trying to flip the state or a Republican trying to hold the state was a motivating factor. And I get emails from people, yeah, I read your article about Texas being a battleground, and it made me get out and knock on doors to stop the Democrats. You know what I'm saying? So I think that motivated people, whether Texas would flip or not.
Yeah. Alexa, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I was trying to, when I think back to 2018, one of the things that often, but putting the numbers aside and, the progress that I think Democrats were happy to have made, one of the things that I think about most often is these events that Beto O'Rourke would have, right? And you would hear from people who had been registered to vote for many, many years and had never either voted or gone to a political event of this sort. You would see new voters who were coming into the process. Once early voting started, he would do these rallies basically outside of polling locations, bring together people and say, all right, now go inside and vote. And I think it's unclear still. I don't know that you can measure how many of those people were going to vote anyway, or were going to vote for Democrats anyway. But it's one of those things that I wonder when we think about these elections, less from a numbers perspective and more from a people perspective, and what motivates someone to cast a ballot, whether they've been on the rolls for forever and have never done it, or whether they've never actually engaged with the sort of more political part of it when it comes to supporting a specific candidate. I don't know that we can either overstate or understate the role that something like that plays, because I don't know that it's measurable, but it's one of the things that was absolutely missing from this election, I think.
Good point. Well, I'll tell you what, I appreciate all four of you. This is fun. I could do this all day, but it's like Dr. Murray says, there are certain categories of people that can do this all day, but we've come to the end of our hour, and I appreciate all four of you: Renée Cross, Gromer Jeffers, Dr. Richard Murray, and Alexa Ura. Your expertise is great, and it's been very helpful to us today. For those of y'all that follow the Hobby Hour, next Hobby Hour is December 16th at noon. And we will have with us the chair of the Senate Republican Caucus, Paul Betancourt, and we will have the chair of the Senate Democratic Caucus, Carol Alvarado. I'll be talking to the two of them about the upcoming legislative session that begins in January. So I hope you'll register and everybody will join. Again, to our panel, thank you very much. To everybody else, please have a great Thanksgiving. As rough as this year has been, there's still a great deal to be thankful for. Please stay safe, happy, and healthy, and be sure you wear your mask.
All right.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Take care.